The phone call that changed everything. There are stories you hear once and forget by morning. Life is full of those. Anecdotes that pass through you like weather, leaving no trace. You nod when they're told. You say the right things, and by the time you're asleep that night, they've already begun to dissolve. You might remember a word or two, a vague outline, and then eventually nothing at all. Then there are stories that work the opposite way. Stories that don't leave, that plant themselves somewhere in the back of your mind and grow roots so deep that pulling them out becomes impossible. And honestly, you stop trying. These are the stories you carry for decades. Not because you want to, but because they've become part of how you understand the world, part of how you see the road at night, and the people who stand at the edge of it. This is one of those stories, and it was told to me so many times in such careful detail that I can close my eyes right now and see it as though it happened to me. My Aunt Carol first told it to me when I was around 10 years old. She told it again the summer I turned 16 and got my first license, a warm July afternoon. Both of us sitting on her porch in western Kentucky, the cicadas going full volume in the trees. She told it again when I left for college, and again in a phone call I still think about. When I called to tell her I'd bought my first car and was planning a road trip through the South. Every time, she told it the same way. Every time she got to a certain point in the story and paused. The way you pause before you say the part that still gets you even after all the years of telling it. And every time, she looked at me, or spoke to me through the phone in that particular, quiet way, and said, "I need you to remember this, not as a fun story, as something real." The story is about her best friend, a woman named Sandra. Sandra grew up in a small town in the hills of eastern Tennessee, about 40 miles outside of Knoxville, in a community where doors were left unlocked and neighbors looked out for each other as a matter of course, rather than obligation. She was a naturally generous person, not in a performative way, not in the way of someone who wants to be seen being generous, but in the deep, private way of someone who simply cannot drive past a problem without stopping to see if there's anything she can do about it. She was the kind of person who would stop to help a stranger change a flat tire in the pouring rain, who would buy a meal for someone who seemed like they needed it, who would give directions to someone lost without being asked. This is not a character flaw. I want to say that clearly because sometimes when people tell stories like this, they frame kindness as the mistake. It wasn't. Sandra's kindness is not what put her in danger. What put her in danger was a man who had already decided to do something terrible and hadn't found a reason not to yet. Those are two very different things. Sandra was 26 years old when this happened. It was an early October morning in 1981, a Tuesday specifically because she always remembered it was a Tuesday. The details that stick being the ones you'd least expect. She was driving from her town into Nashville for a work conference, a trip she made 2 or 3 times a year, about 2.5 hours down Interstate 40. The morning was gray and cool, the trees along the highway just beginning to shift color, the kind of quiet autumn morning that feels like the world is taking a slow, deep breath. She was somewhere around the 40-mile mark outside of Nashville when she spotted the man. He was walking along the shoulder, moving in the same direction she was traveling, and as her headlights swept over him, he stopped and turned. He raised his arm and extended his thumb in the universal gesture. Sandra had picked up hitchhikers before, not frequently, but enough that it wasn't a foreign concept to her. In rural Tennessee in 1981, with the particular upbringing she'd had, it felt no different from holding a door open for someone. She slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. Later, she would tell Carol everything she'd noticed when she first looked at him. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40. medium height and build, wearing a heavy canvas work jacket over a flannel shirt, sturdy boots, a duffel bag hanging off one shoulder. He had the weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors and a tired quality around his eyes that Sandra associated immediately with someone who had been carrying something difficult for a long time. She did not feel frightened. She felt, if anything, mildly sorry for him. He walked up to her window. She asked where he was headed. "Nashville," he said. His voice was soft, a little hoarse, and polite in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He said he was sorry to bother her. He said only if it wasn't an inconvenience. He said he'd been on the road since before sunrise. Sandra reached across and popped open the passenger door. He put his duffel bag in the back seat, buckled his seatbelt carefully. She always mentioned the seatbelt, for some reason, maybe because it seemed so ordinarily considerate, and they pulled back onto the highway. His name, he told her, was Raymond. For the first hour of the drive, they talked easily, the way people sometimes can with strangers. There's a particular freedom in conversation with someone you'll likely never see again, an openness that's harder to sustain with people whose opinion of you matters. Raymond talked about the work he'd been doing, seasonal farming labor in a few different counties, nothing steady, nothing with a future in it. He talked about a younger sister who lived in Nashville and whom he hadn't seen in 2 years. He talked about things being difficult lately, in a general and uncomplaining way, the way people talk about difficulty when they're not looking for sympathy, just for acknowledgement. Sandra talked too, about the conference she was going to, about her parents and her younger brother, about the drive she'd done so many times it had become almost meditative. About 45 minutes past the midpoint of the trip, Sandra pulled off at a truck stop that she always stopped at, a sprawling roadside diner and gas station that had been there long enough to feel like part of the landscape, with a gravel lot and hand-lettered signs in the windows advertising breakfast all day. She ordered for both of them without making a production of it. Eggs and toast and coffee. When the check came, she paid it before Raymond could object. He tried to object anyway. He told her he didn't have money to pay her back, that things were tight right now, that she really didn't have to do that. Sandra told him not to worry about it, that the company was worth it, and she meant it. They sat for another 15 minutes finishing their coffee and talking about things neither of them would remember the specifics of. The kind of comfortable, inconsequential conversation that's more about the presence of another person than its actual content. When they got back in the car and drove the rest of the way to Nashville, the conversation had taken on the easy quality of people who have decided they like each other. When Sandra found a spot on a downtown street to drop Raymond off, he thanked her with the kind of earnestness that made her look away for a moment, the way you do when someone's gratitude is a little more than the situation seems to call for. He asked before he got out if she'd be willing to give him her phone number, not in a way that felt inappropriate. He explained it carefully, said that he'd like to be able to call her someday when things were going better, to let her know how it had turned out, maybe to find some way to repay the kindness, even if it was just a phone call. Sandra wrote her number on the back of a gas station receipt she found in the center console and handed it to him. He got out. She drove away. She felt good about it for the rest of the day, the satisfying, uncomplicated feeling of having done a genuinely kind thing. She thought about Raymond occasionally over the following days, hoped he'd found his sister, hoped things were looking up. And then life moved on and filled the space, and she thought about other things. Then, 8 days later, her phone rang. She picked it up in the kitchen, balancing the receiver between her shoulder and her ear, the way you did in those days." She said hello, and Raymond's voice came down the line, and the first words out of his mouth after hello were, "I need you to listen to me carefully, please." And then he told her. He told her that on the morning she'd picked him up, he had not been going to Nashville for work or to see his sister. He had been going to Nashville because he'd run out of reasons not to. And the road was there, and movement felt better than standing still. He had been in a place, mentally, emotionally, in terms of his life, that he now described as the darkest he'd ever been. He'd been in that place for months. He had been doing things during those months that he was not willing to describe in detail, things that had resulted in him standing at the side of a highway at 6 in the morning with a duffel bag and a plan that he did not want to say out loud, but that was real and specific and not yet abandoned when Sandra's headlights had swept over him and she pulled onto the shoulder. He told her that when he'd gotten into her car, he had a knife in the front pocket of his duffel bag and that he'd already decided what he was going to use it for. He was going to wait until they stopped somewhere, a rest stop, a gas station, somewhere off the highway, away from the traffic. He was going to take her money and her car, and he was going to make sure she couldn't follow him or report him. That had been the plan. Every minute of the first half hour of that drive, the plan had been fully intact. But Sandra had talked to him. She'd asked him about his life and listened while he answered, and she treated the answers like they were worth something. And then she'd bought him breakfast, and she hadn't made him feel like a charity case while she did it. She just paid the check and poured more coffee and kept talking. He said that at some point in that diner he'd tried to remind himself that what he was seeing was just politeness, just social behavior, that it didn't mean anything about him as a person or change anything about what he'd been going to do. But he hadn't been able to make himself believe it, because she hadn't been polite the way people are polite when they're performing consideration. She'd been kind the way people are kind when they can't help it. He said, "You talked to me like I was somebody." He said he'd spent the rest of the drive trying to find a way to undo what he'd already planned, trying to step sideways out of the version of himself that had been standing on that highway at dawn with a knife in his bag. He'd managed it. He'd gotten out of the car and watched her drive away and stood on a street corner in downtown Nashville for a long time before he started moving again. And then, 8 days later, he called. He told her he didn't expect her to forgive him for what he had been planning to do. He told her he wasn't calling to ask for anything. He was calling because he needed her to know one thing. One specific thing that he needed her to carry with her for the rest of her life. "Please, Sandra," he said, "never pick up another hitchhiker. Not anyone. Not ever. Whatever you see on the side of the road, whatever story they have, whatever your instincts tell you, keep the window up and keep driving." Then he hung up. Sandra sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. She tried the number back. It rang to a payphone somewhere in Nashville. She let it ring for a while, long enough that someone else, some random passerby in the city, might have picked it up just to stop the ringing. No one did. She never heard Raymond's voice again. My Aunt Carol told me that Sandra became a different person after that phone call. Not a worse person, or a harder person, but a more precise one. She still helped people. She still stopped when she could help, still gave when she had something to give. But she never again stopped for someone standing at the edge of a road. And when she drove past Hitchhikers, and she drove the same stretch of highway to Nashville for years afterward, she would tighten her hands on the wheel and look straight ahead, and think about the morning she'd been lucky enough to be someone's reason for a plan falling apart. I've been on that same stretch of highway exactly once, driving through Tennessee on a road trip in my late 20s. I didn't stop for the man I passed at mile marker 38, arm out, thumb up, duffel bag at his feet. I just kept driving. And I thought about Sandra. And I thought about Raymond. And I thought about the gas station receipt with a phone number on it, and the 8 days that followed, and the moment a payphone in Nashville rang and rang and rang into nothing. The man with the knife. I want to be straight with you before this story begins. What I'm about to tell you is completely true. I know that's the kind of thing people say all the time, especially on the internet, especially when the story they're telling is strange or frightening. So let me be more specific about what I mean by true. I mean that it happened. I mean that I was there. I mean that the details I'm going to give you, the road, the hour, the knife, the sound the man made, are not embellished, not sharpened for effect, not changed to make the moment land harder. The moment already lands as hard as anything has ever landed in my life. It doesn't need help. My name is Marcus. I'm 31 now. I was 24 when this happened, and I lived at the time in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Clearfield, one of those working-class communities built around industries that have long since moved on, where the downtown has a diner and a hardware store and a VFW hall and not much else, and where most people drive 20 or 30 minutes in some direction to get to anything larger. I was working nights at a distribution warehouse about 12 miles outside of town. The job was physical, loading and unloading freight, moving pallets, running a forklift, and it paid reasonably well for the area, which is why I'd taken it despite the hours. I drove to and from work on Route 879, a two-lane road that cuts through long stretches of dense forest with almost no artificial lighting and very little traffic after midnight. It was a Saturday in late November, 1:15 in the morning. I had just finished a 10-hour shift that had extended to 12 because 2 people had called in sick and we were short-staffed, and the trucks needed to go out on schedule. I was tired in the specific way that makes your hands feel thick and your concentration feel like something you're actively holding together, the way you hold a stack of papers in the wind. My heat was on, and the radio was playing low, and I was watching the road with the narrow focus of someone whose only goal is to stay awake long enough to get home. I spotted him at roughly 200 yards. He was standing at the edge of the road, not walking, standing, which was itself the first thing my brain snagged on, without being able to immediately identify why. He was wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up against the November cold and dark jeans. As my headlights reached him, he raised his arm and put his thumb out. Now here is the part I cannot fully explain, even to myself, all these years later. I slowed down. I don't have a good reason for it. I'd driven past hitchhikers before without the faintest hesitation, but there was something about the specific combination of elements, the hour, the temperature, the particular stillness of him, that made me slow down and pull over before my conscious mind had registered a decision being made. I rolled down the window and asked where he was headed. "Just up the road," he said. His voice was quiet and flat, without inflection, not unfriendly exactly, just empty of the usual social cues. No warmth, no apology for being out at this hour. No thanks for stopping. Just the answer, delivered without color. I told him to get in. He opened the door and climbed in and closed it behind him, and here is the first specific thing I want you to understand. The way he moved was wrong. Not wrong in a way I could have put into words right then. Just wrong in the way that a sound is wrong when you hear a note played slightly off pitch. Your brain registers the error before it can name it. He moved slowly and deliberately, with an economy of motion that suggested he was paying close attention to something I couldn't identify. My truck has heavy doors with a stiff latch. When he tried to close it the first time, it didn't catch. I said something easy and reassuring. "Oh, the doors are tricky, just give it a real hard slam. And then he did something that I have spent 7 years trying to adequately describe and have never quite managed. He turned and looked at me. Then he turned his head forward and stared through the windshield. Then he waited. Not 1 or 2 seconds. 4, maybe 5, which is a long time to sit in absolute silence in a close space next to a stranger at 1 in the morning. Long enough for my nervous system to register something it couldn't name. And then, with no change whatsoever in his expression, he reached back, opened the door, and slammed it shut with enough force to latch it cleanly. My stomach had dropped before I could explain why. I pulled back onto the road and pushed, the speed up to about 75. The posted limit was 55. I wanted to cover ground quickly. I wanted to get to wherever he was going, stop the truck, watch him get out, and drive away without looking back. After about a minute of silence, I asked him again where he was getting off. "Few miles up," he said. Same flat delivery as before. I reached for the radio without turning it up. I thought about turning it up and didn't. There was something in the silence that felt fragile, and like the silence was doing something. And I didn't want to disturb it in case disturbing it made things worse. I don't know if that makes sense. At the time, it felt very clear. Out of the very corner of my eye, the edge of my peripheral vision, I saw him turn his head. He was looking at me. Not glancing, not checking, not the usual reflex of someone looking at the driver of the car they're in. He was looking at me, the way you look at something you're trying to decide about. Steady and blinking and completely without expression. I kept my eyes on the road. I felt his gaze the way you feel a temperature change. Not dramatic, but unmistakable. Physical. Real. It went on for at least a full mile, maybe more. I had stopped tracking time accurately. He said, "You know, I've been asking myself for a while now whether any of this is even worth it." I said something meaningless back. Something like, "Things have a way of looking different later," or some other piece of reflexive reassurance that meant nothing. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He put his hand in the front pocket of his sweatshirt. He said, "I've been carrying something with me for about 3 weeks, trying to figure out when the moment is right." He took out a knife. It had a red handle, bright, almost fluorescent red, which I remember with complete clarity because the color seemed incongruous in a way that was almost funny, except that nothing about the moment was funny. The blade was long enough. He held it in his lap without raising it, without pointing it at me, but with a relaxed grip that suggested it was comfortable in his hand. He'd held it before. I told him with as much steadiness as I could produce to put it away. He looked at me with that same flat expression and said, "Pull over next to that sign." There was a speed limit sign coming up on the right shoulder. I pulled over. I did not consciously decide to do it. My body did it, the way bodies do things under certain kinds of pressure. What happened next, I'm going to tell you plainly, because sanitizing it would be a disservice to the reality of it. He cut himself. He drew the blade along his forearm, slowly and deliberately, next to several older scars that I could see in the dim light from the dashboard. He made a sound that I cannot fully describe, something between a groan and a sigh, something that had too much of something in it for me to be comfortable hearing. Then he looked at me and said with the knife still in his hand, "Get out of the truck. I want to show you something. Behind that sign. Just for a second. Come on." I knew what I knew. I knew it with the kind of certainty that bypasses analysis entirely. If I got out of that truck, I was not going to be getting back in. So I said, "Yeah. Okay. Let's go." I opened the door, I made a point of leaving it open. I stepped out onto the shoulder with my hands at my sides, visible, moving slowly around toward the front of the truck. He opened his door and stepped out on the opposite side and started moving around toward the back. The exact moment, that he moved around the rear of the truck and was no longer in my direct line of sight. I was back behind the wheel, door shut, drive engaged, accelerator on the floor. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I covered the 12 miles home without slowing below 60. I pulled into my driveway, went inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and stayed there for almost an hour without doing anything at all. I called the county sheriff's department the next morning and gave them everything I had: the location, the time, the description, the knife, the hoodie, the approximate age. A deputy took my report. I never heard back. I never found out if they found him, if anyone else encountered him, if something worse happened somewhere else on that road that night. I still drive Route 879 for work. The stretch where I pulled over is marked by that speed limit sign. Every time I pass it, I look at it once, and then look straight ahead. I have never, in 7 years, stopped for anyone on that road at night. I've never stopped for anyone on any road at any hour after dark. I never will. The wrong pickup. Some mistakes embarrass you. You tell them later as cautionary tales, and you laugh at yourself while you're telling them. And the laughter is genuine because the outcome, in the end, was fine. You were stupid. Things could have gone sideways. But they didn't, and now it's just a good story. And then there are the other kind. The ones where the outcome was fine only because of a sequence of coincidences so fragile and improbable that thinking about them too carefully makes it hard to breathe. These stories don't embarrass you. They haunt you. They haunt you because you understand, in a way that goes down to the bone, exactly how easily the story could have ended on a different page. Now, I'm going to tell you one of those. My name is Tyler. I grew up outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was 17 years old the night this happened. I am 27 now. 10 years is a long time, and I've mostly made peace with it, but there is still a particular stretch of county road in the Virginia Piedmont that I cannot drive on after dark without my hands tightening on the wheel. There is still a specific model of dark pickup truck that makes something tighten in my chest when I see it in my rearview mirror at night. There are some things that leave a mark even when you can't see it anymore. It started at a party, the way so many stories that go wrong at 17 start at a party. It was a summer gathering at the house of a kid named Derek, who lived about 6 miles down the same 2-lane county road that led to my family's house. His property backed up to a wood line. His nearest neighbors were a quarter mile in either direction, and the party was held outside, which meant that the music and the noise and the general chaos of about 60 teenagers in a field behind a farmhouse was basically invisible to the outside world. In the rural stretch of Virginia where we lived, an event of that size was a significant thing. When there was a party that big, practically everyone showed up. I got there around 9 in the evening with my friend Jake and his girlfriend Melissa. Jake was 18, drove a used Honda Civic with a dented rear fender, and had, in that easy way of people who are slightly older than you and therefore seem more capable of handling things, assured me that he'd get us home whenever I was ready to go. I hadn't planned on drinking much. I didn't drink much in those days. But the night was warm and the field was full of people I knew, and the energy of the whole thing was loose and celebratory in a way that made it easy to lose track of the small practical things. I lost track of the time. I lost track of how many cups I'd had, of whatever someone had mixed in a large red cooler near the barn. And sometime around 1 in the morning, I lost track of Jake. I spent about 20 minutes looking for him. I went through the backyard, the front porch, the kitchen where a group of people had gathered around a truck with its stereo going. I asked several people if they'd seen him and got distracted. Vague answers from everyone. Melissa was nowhere to be seen either. I borrowed the house phone and called Jake's cell twice and got his voicemail both times. The obvious and unwelcome conclusions settled over me like cold water. Jake had left. He had left, with Melissa, without telling me. And I was standing in a field 6 miles from home at 1 in the morning with no car, no cell phone, and blood alcohol that made walking in a straight line an active project. I stood on the front porch for a few minutes trying to think through the situation clearly. I considered asking someone at the party for a ride. But the people I'd been talking to all night had been drinking just as much as I had, and I wasn't going to get in a car with any of them. I considered calling my parents. I considered this option and then did not do it, in the way that 17-year-olds weigh their options. I started walking. The road was completely dark. The county didn't light these stretches. There was no need to, most nights, with the traffic being what it was. The sky was clear and full of stars, which gave enough ambient light to see the white line at the road's edge if I focused on it. I walked in the middle of the lane. The air was warm and thick with summer insects, and the tree frogs were going in the woods on both sides, and under other circumstances it might have been a pleasant enough walk. It was not, under these circumstances, a pleasant walk. After about 15 or 20 minutes, I saw headlights behind me. I turned and stuck my thumb out without really thinking about it. I was a 17-year-old kid who needed a ride home. It seemed in that moment like the most straightforward possible solution to a very simple problem. The vehicle slowed and stopped beside me. It was a pickup truck, mid-size, dark blue, a few years old, the kind you see on every country road in the South and think nothing of. The man behind the wheel was somewhere in his early to mid-40s, heavy-set, with a short gray beard and the kind of easy, settled manner that you associate with someone who spends a lot of time in trucks and doesn't get worked up about things. He leaned over the center console and looked at me through the passenger window and asked where I was headed. I told him. Down the road, white mailbox on the left side. About 6 miles. He smiled a little. Said that was no problem. Told me to hop in. I climbed in and buckled my seatbelt and thanked him. The cab was warm. It smelled faintly of cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. Motor oil, maybe? Or something chemical and vaguely industrial. He pulled back onto the road. I remember the first few minutes of the drive. I remember him asking me something about the party and me giving some half-formed answer. I remember the hum of the engine and the warm air from the vents and the seat that was slightly reclined from the position he had it in, and the specific, pulling exhaustion that comes at the end of a night when your body has been running on borrowed energy for hours. I remember trying to stay awake and thinking that I should say something to keep myself awake, and then not finding the words, and then nothing. I was asleep. Genuinely deeply asleep. The kind that takes you under so quickly you don't remember the moment of going under at all. I don't know how long I was out. I came back into consciousness gradually, the way you do when you've gone truly deep, not a sudden waking but a slow reassembly. Sound and motion coming back first, then the physical sensation of being in a seat with a seatbelt across my chest, then the interior of the truck coalescing into focus around me. The engine was still running. The man was still driving. I looked out the window. Nothing outside was familiar. This is the moment. This is the specific 10 seconds that I want you to understand, if you understand nothing else from this story. The road I knew, the road I'd driven or ridden on dozens of times, the one that led from Derek's house to the white mailbox on the left, 6 miles, had a specific character. A low wooden bridge over a creek. A right-angled turn at an old stone wall. a stretch where the trees thinned out and you could see a church steeple in the distance. None of that was outside. The road we were on was wider, straighter, more open. The landscape felt fundamentally different. I had been asleep long enough to be somewhere that was not where I was supposed to be. The adrenaline arrived before the conscious understanding did. I asked him, with as much casual steadiness as I could produce, where we were. He looked over at me. He said, "So what were you doing out that late anyway? I want you to really hear that." He answered my question, a direct question about our location, with an entirely different, entirely unrelated question about my evening, asked with a warm, conversational tone, asked as though my question had never happened. I said, "Hey, you can just drop me off anywhere. Right here is fine, actually." He said, "No, that's all. One word. Flat and final and completely without aggression," which was almost the strangest part. Not threatening, just decided. The way you say no to something that isn't up for discussion. I felt sick. Not the anxiety kind of sick, or the fear kind of sick, though both of those were present. Physically sick, viscerally and urgently, in a way that was building and insistent and not going to give me much more time before it became involuntary. The motion of the truck, the alcohol still in my system, the adrenaline spike, the smell of the cab, everything combined into a single, undeniable biological verdict. And here is what I will tell you for the rest of my life. Sometimes your body makes the right decision before your brain gets there. I turned toward the man. I continued to gag, increasingly and obviously. He looked at me with an expression that was half alarm and half something else. He took his eyes off the road. He started to lean slightly away from me, the instinctive flinch of someone who sees what's coming and cannot stop it. I threw up, completely, comprehensively in his direction, on his lap and the center console and the seat between us. The man made a sound that was equal parts disgust and fury and yanked the steering wheel to the right. The truck skidded heavily onto the shoulder and stopped hard, the tires popping on the gravel. And he was already half standing and cursing loudly and trying to deal with the mess. And in that window, that 2-second window between the truck stopping and his full attention returning to me, I had the door open and I was running. I ran off the shoulder and into the dark at the side of the road and kept going until the trees swallowed me. I dropped behind a dense cluster of bushes and flattened myself against the ground and lay completely still. My heart was moving so fast I could feel it in my ears. I heard the truck door open, footsteps on gravel, and then the thin, sweeping beam of a flashlight beginning to move through the trees, slow and methodical, back and forth. He was looking for me. Twice the beam passed directly over me. The light slid across the top of the bushes I was lying behind and continued on, and I held my breath both times and did not move, and both times it moved away. I heard his footsteps going further into the trees, further from where I was. I got up and ran back to the road. The truck was still on the shoulder, driver's side door standing open. I tried the passenger handle out of instinct. Locked. Of course it was locked. I stood there for a half-second that felt like several minutes. And then, in the distance, coming from my right, I saw headlights. I ran into the middle of the road. The car swerved and braked, and the driver rolled down her window with an expression that was equal parts alarm and irritation. She was an older woman on her way home from a late shift at the hospital where she was a nurse, and she looked at me, a soaking, shaking 17-year-old standing in the middle of a rural road at what was now 2 or 2:30 in the morning. And her expression changed immediately to something else. I told her. I pointed at the truck on the shoulder. I said, "Please." She told me to get in. She drove me to my road and waited in her car until I made it through my front door, which I thought about for years afterward. The specific grace of that, staying to make sure. I woke my parents. I told them everything. My father, after a brief and focused silence, asked if I had gotten the truck's license plate number. I had not. I hadn't been thinking about the license plate. I'd been thinking about running. I gave the county sheriff's department a description the next morning. Dark blue midsize pickup, male driver, early to mid-40s, short gray beard, and that was everything I had. I never heard back. I don't know if they found him. I don't know if anyone else got into that truck that night or any night after, and I've learned over 10 years to stop asking that question as a way of falling asleep. I have never stuck my thumb out since that summer night. Not once. Not even as a joke. Not even in the kind of hypothetical conversation where you're only speculating. I don't hitch. I don't hitchhike. I find another way, or I wait, or I call someone whose presence I trust completely. Some lessons cost too much to repeat. The wrong feeling. Before I give you the last story in this collection, I want to talk for a moment about something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about situations like these. We live in a world where it is very easy, from a position of safety and comfort, to approach the question of roadside strangers statistically. People will tell you that most hitchhikers are harmless, and statistically, most probably are. People will point out that the cultural mythology around hitchhiking danger is shaped by sensationalized stories and crime reporting that emphasizes the dramatic over the ordinary. And there's some truth to that too. There is a real and legitimate conversation to be had about the way fear gets weaponized against the vulnerable. About how the assumption of danger has historically been used to justify ignoring people in genuine need. I believe that conversation is worth having. I also believe, completely and without reservation, that it is entirely separate from the question of what you should do alone in a car at 1 a.m. on a dark road. Because Sandra, Marcus, and Tyler are not statistics. They are 3 specific human beings who made a single decision on a single night and who are still here today, not because they made the right call, but because they were lucky. Sandra was lucky that the man in her passenger seat happened to encounter her kindness at a moment when he was capable of being moved by it. Marcus was lucky that he kept his nerve for about 3 seconds in a situation that warranted immediate panic. Tyler was lucky that his own body did something useful before his brain had finished processing what was happening. Luck is not a plan. And these are the stories we know about because the people involved survived to tell them. The last story I want to share was told to me by a woman I'll call Renee. She was a nurse practitioner in her early 40s, working at a regional medical center in rural Arkansas. She had been driving the same stretch of state highway between her home and the hospital for almost 14 years. The same road, twice a day, 5 days a week, for 14 years. She knew every curve of it. She knew the places where deer were likely to cross and the places where the asphalt had been patched badly and left a ridge that rattled your suspension if you hit it at speed. She knew the road the way you know a room you've lived in for years, not consciously but in your body. It was a Thursday night in late October, a little past midnight, and she was driving home after a shift that had run 2 hours over because of a highway accident that had come in at 10 and occupied the department until well after the end of her scheduled time. She was the specific kind of tired that healthcare workers know. Not just physical exhaustion, but the hollow, porous feeling of having spent 12 hours inside other people's worst moments. She had the seat heater on and a podcast playing, and she was making a mental grocery list for the morning, which is what she did to keep herself awake on the drive home. She almost missed him. He was well off the shoulder, further than she would have expected, close to the tree line, and she only caught him because her high beams lit up the reflective stripe on the side of his sneaker. He was sitting down, not standing, hunched forward with his arms resting over his knees. As she passed, he looked up. In the rearview mirror, for just a moment, she caught his face. She drove past. A quarter mile down the road, she turned around. She told me that she did it because of what she did for a living. Because 14 years in clinical medicine had trained her to stop and assess before deciding someone didn't need help. She pulled over about 40 feet ahead of where he was sitting, left the car in drive with her foot on the brake, and rolled her window halfway down. He stood up and walked towards her. He was young, 19 or 20, she guessed, wearing a thin jacket over a hoodie, the kind of outfit that made her immediately aware of the temperature, which was in the low 40s. He didn't have his phone out. As he got closer, she registered his expression, which she had described in the mirror as empty, but which up close was something different. It was watchful, calculating, the expression of someone in the middle of an active thought process. He leaned on the doorframe and looked into her car. He told her his car had broken down about 2 miles back. He asked if she could give him a lift to the nearest town, just to find an open gas station, just to use a phone. Renee did what she always did in assessments. She observed without showing that she was observing. She noted the thin jacket on a 40-degree night and the absence of any phone in his hands or visible pockets. She noted the way his eyes moved around the interior of her car, not curiously, the way you'd glance around the inside of someone's vehicle, but with a specific, directed attention she couldn't quite name but recognized. She noted that his hands resting on her doorframe about 8 inches from her window were completely relaxed, not the hands of someone cold or frightened or in the middle of an automotive emergency. Just relaxed. She kept her voice level the way she'd learned to keep it in emergency situations when leveling was important. She told him she was sorry, but she couldn't take passengers tonight. She told him she would call the highway patrol right now and have someone sent to help him. She told him they'd be there within 20 minutes. He didn't step back from the door. He said, "You sure? It's pretty cold out here. I'd really appreciate it. I won't be any trouble," she said. "I'm sure. I'm making the call right now." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough to be a moment that had weight to it. Pressure. The quality of a silence in which something is being decided. Then he stepped back from the car. She put it in drive and pulled onto the road and drove the remaining miles to the lights of town without slowing down. She did call the highway patrol. She gave them the mile marker and the description and the story about the broken-down car. A deputy went out within the hour. There was no broken-down car at that location or anywhere nearby. There was no young man in a thin jacket. The highway patrol checked a 2-mile radius in both directions and found nothing. Renee told me something that I've thought about many times since she said it, and I want to give it to you here exactly as she gave it to me. She said, "There are 2 kinds of wrong feelings. The first kind comes from unfamiliarity, from seeing something you're not used to, and having a gut response that's really just prejudice in disguise. That feeling is worth questioning. It's worth sitting with and asking what it's actually based on. The second kind is different. It's your nervous system responding to specific information, to something real that it has already processed before your conscious mind has caught up. That feeling is not prejudice. That feeling is data. And in 14 years of emergency medicine, in rooms with people in genuine crisis, with every kind of situation you can imagine, and several you probably can't, I have never once been wrong about the second kind." She paused. She said, What I felt that night when that boy looked into my car was the second kind, and I drove away, and I made the phone call, and I went home to my family, and that is the whole story. I want to close this with something that is not entirely a horror story. Somewhere in Tennessee there is a woman. If she is still living, she would be in her mid-60s now, who has never forgotten a phone call she received 8 days after a Tuesday morning in October from a man she'd given breakfast and a phone number to, and nothing else. A man who called to tell her that she had accidentally saved her own life by being kind. We don't know who Raymond was. We don't know what he did after that payphone call. We don't know if the change that Sandra made in him lasted a week, a year, a lifetime. We don't know if he hurt someone later or helped someone, or simply disappeared into the current of the ordinary world without leaving a trace in either direction. What we know is what Sandra knows, and what she's carried with her for 40 years, and what she passed to Carol, and what Carol passed to me, every time she told the story with that particular quiet in her voice. The road at night is not the same as the road in the daytime. The person standing at the edge of it with their thumb out is not simply a person who needs a ride. You can be a good person, a genuinely, deeply good person, the kind who stops to help strangers and buys breakfast for people they don't know, and still keep your windows up and your foot on the gas when someone is standing at the shoulder in the dark. Because Sandra's Raymond had a knife in his bag. Marcus's passenger had a knife in his pocket. Tyler's driver answered a question about location with a question about an evening and then said no to a 17-year-old who just wanted to go home. Renee's young man had hands that were too relaxed for a cold October night with no phone and a broken-down car 2 miles away. You cannot see the inside of a person from the side of the road. You cannot know, once you've stopped, which kind you've stopped for. So don't stop. Keep driving. Keep the doors locked and the windows up and your eyes on the road ahead. And remember what Raymond said. In the last words he ever spoke to the woman who had made him feel like a person when he had run out of reasons to feel like one. Please, never pick up another hitchhiker. Not ever. Please. Extended reflection. Why we stop. There is a psychology to the roadside stranger, and it is worth understanding. Human beings are built for social trust. We are, at a biological level, creatures who survived for hundreds of thousands of years, not by acting alone, but by cooperating, by extending small gestures of trust toward strangers and having those gestures returned. Building the web of social connection that made communities possible, that made civilization possible. The impulse to help someone standing at the side of a road in apparent need is not a glitch in our programming. It is a feature. It is one of the better features. The problem is that features can be exploited. Researchers who study predatory behavior in violent crime have documented a consistent pattern. The most effective way to get a potential victim to lower their guard is not intimidation. Intimidation makes people alert. The most effective approach is the opposite. It is helplessness. It is the presentation of need. It is the universal human trigger that says, this person requires assistance, and you are someone who can provide it. Your nervous system responds to this signal before your conscious mind has processed the context, and in that gap between signal and analysis, decisions get made. Raymond understood this, whether he understood it consciously or not. So did the man on Route 879 in Pennsylvania. So did the man in the dark blue truck in Virginia. So did the young man with 2 relaxed hands on a cold October night in Arkansas. They understood that the person most likely to stop is the person whose instinct toward kindness is strongest. They positioned themselves to attract exactly that person. And in 3 of these 4 stories, they succeeded. Because Sandra and Marcus and Tyler were kind people. Because kindness in those moments felt like the most natural thing in the world. Renee was kind too. She turned her car around in the dark because she was the kind of person who couldn't drive past someone who might need help. The difference was 14 years of clinical training and a specific capacity she had developed in the hard school of emergency medicine for distinguishing between the 2 kinds of wrong feelings. She stopped. She assessed. She declined. She drove away. And whatever was going to happen didn't happen. There is one more thing I want to say before we close. I've thought many times over the years about Raymond's phone call, about what it means that he made it, about what kind of person sits with a decision like that for 8 days, the guilt of what he'd planned, the relief of not having done it, the complicated weight of having been changed by something as simple as another person's decency, and then finds a payphone and calls the number on the gas station receipt. He didn't have to call. He could have let it dissolve into the past, the way most things dissolve. He could have told himself that nothing had happened, that no harm had been done, that the plan had been abandoned and therefore it didn't exist anymore. He could have moved on without a word, and Sandra never would have known. He called because he needed her to be safe, not just from him, from anyone. He called because her kindness had made him for a moment into the kind of person who couldn't live with the idea of her being hurt by someone else because of a habit he could warn her out of. He called because she had made him feel like a person, and people, even people who have been doing terrible things, sometimes want to protect other people. That phone call didn't erase what Raymond had been planning to do. It didn't change what he was. But it is, I think, one of the most human things in any of these stories. Not a redemption. Just a moment of something recognizable. A moment of someone trying, in the only way available to him, to make something right. Sandra has never forgotten it. She's told it to everyone who matters to her, everyone whose safety she cares about. She told it to Carol. Carol told it to me. I'm telling it to you. The road at night belongs to everyone, but not everyone on it is who they appear to be. Drive carefully. Drive home. And if you see someone standing at the side of the road in the dark with their arm out and their thumb up, keep driving. Remember Sandra. Remember the payphone. Remember the last thing Raymond said. And keep driving. A note on these stories. The accounts in this video were collected from real people across the United States. People who came forward, in some cases years, or even decades after the events described, because they felt that the stories needed to be told. Not for drama, not for attention, but because they understood, in the particular way that survivors understand things, that a story shared has the potential to prevent the same story from happening to someone else. Sandra shared hers with Carol because Carol was young and getting ready to drive alone for the first time, and Sandra couldn't let her go without the thing she'd learned. Marcus shared his because he wanted it to exist somewhere outside of his own memory, somewhere people could find it, write it, feel the weight of it, and make a different decision than the one he made on a November night on Route 879. Tyler shared his because his younger cousin was 17 and had just gotten a license, and the party season was coming, and Tyler knew what parties at 17 looked like, and he wasn't willing to let his cousin figure this out the hard way. Renee shared hers because she spent 14 years in medicine and she knows that the best interventions are the ones that happen before the emergency. These are not statistics. They are not cautionary abstractions. They are specific human beings whose lives very nearly went differently. on specific roads, at specific hours, in specific moments that could have turned on a single different choice. We share them because the road is long and the night is dark, and the lights of the next town are further away than they look. We share them because every person reading or watching this has, at some point, been alone on a highway after midnight and made a decision they hoped was the right one. And we share them so you know what the right one is. Drive safe. Drive home.